Well, thank you for those kind words, Medle. When they didn't make it to the Woodstock record, but the MC5 played there, if anyone's old enough to remember that, a proto-punk band which had a song called Kick Out the Jams. I won't continue with the rest of the lyrics, but you can YouTube it. Kick Out the Jams, MC5. Anyway, sorry. Anyway, I'm going to talk about something that I originally proposed at CyCon about 5-6 years ago, before things got as bad as they are, and then it was kind of an initial idea. But anyway, the digital era, with all of its benefits, has profoundly changed the security environment of liberal democracies. We face potential destruction of national infrastructures and militaries in ways unimaginable a quarter century ago. Even, and as we've discovered in the past several years, even the electoral process in a number of democracies has come under severe threat, with attempts to alter outcomes in elections in a number of places, mainly in the transatlantic region. To spare you the necessity of sitting here and listening to my whole speech, I'm basically going to say that what we need to handle this is something like a cyber NATO, a coalition of liberal democracies not bounded or restricted by geography in the way that NATO is today, and that can better respond to the ubiquity of threats. This will be difficult to achieve, but I argue that the alternatives to something like this are worse. These new threats basically can affect anyone. Only one Russian cyber operation, APT-28 or Fancy Bear, has attacked servers in ministries, political parties, candidates, and think tanks in the United States, Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden, Ukraine, Italy, and France, and on and on. And indeed, they've even attacked the servers of the International Association of Athletics Federations, or more precisely, the subgroup WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency. So even international organizations have been attacked by this one group. And military communications have been targeted, and so on. Yet APT-28 is but one of a numerous group from Russia alone. Nor is Russia the only authoritarian government seeking to increase its advantage through cyber operations. It is also clear that Iran has carried out its own offensive cyber operations to great effect, most importantly against Saudi Arabia and Aramco. Chinese, primarily groups affiliated with the People's Liberation Army, have targeted militaries as well as intellectual property in companies all the world over. In other words, the digital age has ushered in an era of new security threats, perhaps previously unimaginable, but perhaps previously imaginable from cyberpunk novels in the 80s, but not seen until the past decade. Governments, meanwhile, have been rather slow to respond. I won't get into that, but multilateral organizations such as NATO and the European Union have been even slower. Meanwhile, international organizations such as the UN have failed even to broker a treaty arrangement to prevent the use of digital weapons. Instead, responses to these threats have remained basically national. While groups such as APT-28 or 29 have been identified in a number of European countries as well as the US, each country has faced them alone. NATO has not adopted a unified response. Some may quibble, but my view of it. Indeed, what we call cyber remains stuck in the intelligence domain. Nations are loath to share. I recall how in my own country, Estonia, we reported discovering a worm. We reported to NATO, and the response was, "Oh, you too." I don't think that's how we should be doing things. Now, just looking at sort of back a little bit in history, virtually every history of what is now known as cyber war or cyber warfare begins with an account of an attack on this place, Estonia, 10 years ago. In 2007, 11 years ago, this country's governmental banking and news media servers were paralyzed with distributed denial of service or DDoS attacks. and people's access to virtually all major online and digitally based services was blocked. Cyber attacks, of course, have a far longer history, but until 2007, they were generally carried out for espionage, not to damage adversaries or to make a political point. This case was different, and this is why all these history books will always start with this. It was overt and public. As I said a number of years ago, this was, if we take Clausewitz's definition of war, this was, in fact, continuation of policy by other means, and therefore we can classify it, at least in the Clausewitzian sense, as being war. It meant all as a punishment for Estonia's government's decision to move a Soviet-era statue from the center of the capital to a military cemetery. Since 2007, cyber warfare and the continuation of policy by other means has proliferated and in ever more virulent form. Attacks blanking out regions, preceding bombing in conflict zones with DDoS attacks we saw already a year later in 2008 in Georgia, crashing electrical grids, Ukraine 2016-17, private companies, Sony 2015, hacking into parliaments, the Bundestag in 2015-2016, political think tanks and parties before major elections. There's the DNC, and according to former Director Comey, also the RNC, though we don't have any proof of that, as well as the German political parties, think tanks. Presidential campaigns, of course, Hillary Clinton and Macron, 2016-17. Government ministries, Dutch ministries, Italian Foreign Office, the departments of U.S. Department of State and Defense. In one especially egregious case, records of 23 million employees of the U.S. federal government. Those of you who are here from the U.S. and in the military, you've probably received all kinds of notices when they hacked the Office of Personnel Management. Recent testimony and leaks in the U.S. report attempts by a foreign power to delete or alter voter data in 21 or possibly 39 states before the U.S. presidential election. This represents merely those attacks that are admitted to by the victims, not those that have gone unreported. Now, a decade ago, the idea of a major cyber attack was strictly hypothetical. Indeed, NATO was originally rather skeptical about the attack in 2007. I mean, a number of countries just didn't believe that it had taken place. I argue back, there's some member states that wouldn't have noticed the DDoS attack at all, but I won't say that anymore. But indeed, it was something so new they didn't quite understand it, and they say, you know, if you don't understand the concept of DDoS, then I mean the fact that these attacks came from all over the world, says, well, see, it didn't come from any one place, and try to explain that to people. It's rather difficult. I have a whole lecture on C.P. Snow and the two cultures, science and humanities and military people. Well, I mean, sort of politicians generally come from the humanities, but I won't get into that either today. But since the recognition of politically motivated DDoS attacks and their paralyzing impact, the focus of cybersecurity has shifted to more elaborate possibilities. Use of malware to shut down or blow up critical infrastructure, including electricity and communication networks, water supplies, and even traffic light systems in major cities. I mean, I think it's happened in LA. Some disgruntled employees made all the lights turn red. They got caught and went to jail, but can you imagine if in a major city someone, instead of turning them all red, turned them all green? I mean, hello? Anyway, where was I? Okay. And all this goes beyond DDoS and requires, as it were, hacking, as we know the term, breaking into servers or a computer system, not merely blocking access, as with DDoS. Indeed, the vulnerability of critical infrastructure became a primary concern of governments and the private sector as we have proceeded through the past 11 years. These kinds of cyber attacks could mean shutting down a country or its military, rendering it unable to oppose a conventional attack. In 2010, the Stuxnet worm, which spun Iranian plutonium enriching centrifuges out of control, warned us of the power of cyber to do serious damage to physical systems. Leon Panetta, U.S. Secretary of Defense, warned in 2012 of the potential of a cyber Pearl Harbor. And subsequent events, such as the shutting down of a Ukrainian power plant in 2015 and 16, or rather 2016 and 17, through cyber operations, showed that such concerns are hardly unwarranted. The Mirai attack, the bot-based, IoT-based attack on the DIN server in the US, which is the Mirai attack. WannaCry, not Petya ransomware, and just a week ago the report by the FBI that some 500,000 compromised routers only indicated the increasing power of cyber to disrupt. At the same time, however, it is worth noting that one can do considerable damage to national security and the private sector without disabling infrastructure, and the private sector as well. The hack of Sony and the Office of Personnel Management attests to this. I mean, basically, as I mentioned, 23 million records, including the psychological profiles of people working for NSA and CIA, is known by some country that doesn't like the United States. But they're good examples of the extremely dangerous kinds of breach that can endanger a country's national security or its commerce. From these examples, we can see that cyber attacks as a term is a catch-all, spanning a range of activities from attacks that can destroy a nation's critical infrastructure on the extreme side to subtler attacks, hacking politicians, leaking compromising information, and jeopardizing election integrity. Now, as I said, the recognition of threats in the digital world has been slow in coming, although the US and others foresaw potential threats as far back as the 1990s. But the rest has been kind of slow. I mean, the premier security policy conference, the Munich Security Conference, which just held its cyber event here yesterday, and one that is usually on top of everything. I mean, they held their first panel ever on cybersecurity in 2011. That was 7 years ago. That just should give you an idea of how quickly things have been moving, or alternatively, how late people came to understand the power of cyber. All of these concerns have fallen under the broad rubric of symmetrical warfare. We keep talking about what is the response, what do we do back to them? If they do this, whatever they did, and traditionally that's the way it's always been. Whatever they did to you, once you figured out who they were, you could do back to them. And cyber attacks were traditionally viewed as lying within the realm of traditional warfare. It was just a new domain. In fact, the US in 2010 declared cyber to be the 5th domain of warfare. NATO declared it to be the 4th, because NATO doesn't do space. And moreover, the US Department of Defense has explicitly said that a cyber attack need not be met in the cyber domain. So a kinetic response is is not ruled out. Now, while NATO has acknowledged the potential threats of cyber and propaganda, it has done fairly little operationally, I'm sorry to say. NATO did set up a center of excellence in cybersecurity here in Tallinn, and later a center for strategic communication in Riga, Latvia. Here, this is one case I'll just interject, was a case of a Russian own goal, because if the idea was to punish Estonia, the result was Estonia ended up getting a NATO Center of Excellence, so it didn't really kind of work out. But even within the alliance, as I mentioned before, there has been little cooperation. These centers, in fact, are restricted to dealing with attacks on the O in NATO. If you know your NATO history, you had the North Atlantic Treaty, but it really wasn't anything. North Atlantic Treaty was 1948, 1949. You put the O into NATO, and NATO became NATO with an organization. So what we see, I mean, you can get great work if it attacks NATO structures. If it attacks an alliance member, an ally, then it doesn't really fall into the purview of the centers. Now, it's been only a year since a broader consensus has emerged among intelligence agencies and security policy experts that electoral processes themselves come under attack. Manipulations have included doxing or publishing materials obtained through hacking, as we saw in the case of Hillary Clinton and Emmanuel Macron. Of course, Macron, learning from Clinton, was, or his staff, was rather bright, since they saw what happened to Hillary Clinton, so then they seeded their server with fake compromising material. So when, in fact, Macron was doxxed, they could say, well, you know, this is obviously a fake document you people are putting out. So, I mean, there are sort of, we do learn, and Macron's staff did. And such tactics, of course, that we saw there as doxing have been bolstered by manufacturing fake news on an industrial scale and propagating these through bots or robot accounts on social media. And then, of course, gaining currency. These are propagated by real users, willing, if not at least, but though generally, I guess, unwitting accomplices. And we've seen all sorts of cases of this. The best one, I mean, I guess the one that's been making the rounds recently is the IRA, not the Irish Republican Army, but the IRA in Petersburg. Internet Research Agency set up fake white nationalists and fake black groups in the United States, and they got lots and lots of followers within the United States. And then one day, the IRA calls for a demonstration of the white nationalists, and then on the black activist or blacktivist page, as it was, called for a counter demonstration in the same place at the same time. Now, I mean, nothing bad happened, but that's pretty subversive activity. So, and you can imagine what that might have done what might have happened had there actually been a serious violent confrontation. And of course, when I talk about willing accomplices, it's not simply, or unwilling accomplices, it's just simply unwitting people. One study done on the 3 months before the election in the United States on Facebook showed that 8.7 million fake news stories were shared by users, but they shared only 7.3 million genuine stories. Now, this is part of, I mean, the share stuff is more sensationalist, even if it's fake, but the sensationalist part is what makes people tweet. This is part of our psychology. It wasn't any different in an Estonian village 200 years ago, and stories get magnified, and that's something we're going to have to deal with, unfortunately. Of course, more worrisome is the prospect of manipulations through hacking into unsecured voting machines and by potentially altering or deleting voter data. When those news came out, I remember virtually everyone saying, oh, we have to go back to paper. Unfortunately, people don't realize that in the digital era, the vote is only one part of a long process that begins with the voter registration rolls and then goes through all of the distribution of the voting lists and the candidates to the various election districts down to the polling places. Then you vote on paper, that's great, even if it's been manipulated before. And then the tabulation of the votes, and in most countries in Europe have multiple mandate election districts. Calculations of who wins an election gets really complex. It's done digitally, so you can manipulate all along the entire pathway from beginning to end. Even if you vote on paper, it doesn't get you anything, but for some reason, politicians don't want to believe that, and they keep saying, let's go back to paper. And in fact, the propagation of fake news need not even be tied to elections, and no longer is. Instead, they can simply be used in an attempt to sway public opinion. The Syria hoax hashtag, which came out almost within hours of news of Syria's use of chemical weapons in spring 2007, the hashtag said it was a Western hoax, which was spread virally by Twitter bots, and then became a serious trending topic on Twitter. Fake news regarding NATO troop assignments in Eastern Europe have been commonplace. I hope Director Sartz will talk about that sometime. In the French election campaign, of spring 2017, bots and fake news accounts spread lies and scurrilous facts about one candidate, Emmanuel Macron, while leaving his primary opponent, Marine Le Pen, untouched. So in the past several years, in this new digital age, we've seen that the threat landscape facing democracies has dramatically changed, ranging from traditional threats such as destruction or incapacitation of critical infrastructure to what we might call, erroneously I'd say, soft threats, the manipulation of electoral democracy and public opinion. Two fundamental differences emerge from pre-digital threats. First, geography or physical distance, the key determinant of security since the beginning of conflict, basically the first time a pre-hominid threw a rock again to kill another pre-hominid. Distance here has become irrelevant. Throughout history, or even prehistory, proximity to threats or hostile actors was a primary motivator of security policy, even if it's just a matter of building a wall. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization for a reason. It is a defense organization of liberal democracies in a geographical space, constrained inter alia by tank logistics, bomber range, the placement of troops. It is based on geography. Countries, after all, traditionally have been invaded or attacked by neighbors, not by adversaries far away. Indeed, until the age of intercontinental ballistic missiles, distance from threats was the greatest source of security and proximity the greatest vulnerability. I mean, here, look at where we are, right? We've been invaded on an average of once every 50 years over the past 1,000 years. I mean, and if you look at who did it, I mean, they're not coming from Uruguay. I'll leave that there. But this is no longer true. Digital threats do not recognize distance. One is just as vulnerable half a globe away as from next door. In fact, the term force in conflict, until recently, overlapped with the definition of force in physics. Mass times acceleration, or distance divided by time squared. Then today, distance has been eliminated, while time has become infinitesimal. And this is why, in the digital age, the earlier basis of alliances, be they NATO, or in fact Sparta's Peloponnesian League, distance disappears. Everyone is equally vulnerable to attack, regardless of borders or of physical distance. And cyber is a tool that can be used to attack anywhere. Secondly, in the digital era, liberal democracies are far more vulnerable than before to asymmetric attacks from autocratic states. Propaganda, fake news, disinformation are all as old as the Trojan horse. Or you might even go back to, say, the snake in Adam and Eve. But in any case, yet most of what was considered disinformation as late as the 20th century had little effect. In the pre-digital age, disinformation could not easily be propagated. Fake news could not swamp and overwhelm the news media because the news media was edited by people who were kind of responsible and would not print silly things. Voting rolls could not be breached on a massive scale and across many election districts. Moreover, only liberal democracies are fundamentally vulnerable to attacks and manipulations of the electoral process. Authoritarian governments need not fear external manipulations of electoral processes, as these are manipulated by those in power anyway. While it would be difficult to imagine a liberal democracy employing the same methods against Russia as the Russians used in the US and French presidential elections, let's be honest, attempting to do so would have no effect. I mean, do you really think anyone could have altered the results of the Russian elections? I mean, to have an effect, one needs to have an adversary that also has freedom of expression and holds free and fair elections to effect. Of course, then again, we don't do that because, it's been a truism that democracies don't fight one another, so we're in a bind. From a security policy perspective, however, the possibilities of using digital manipulations can be quite attractive to the adversary. Why bother with military interventions or attacks, or even military-style digital attacks for that matter, I mean breaking down infrastructure, if it suffices to use digital means to get a candidate or even a political party into office that will do your bidding or at least follow a policy line favorable to you. Certainly a Le Pen in France promising to leave NATO, or the defeat of Angela Merkel in the 2017 German elections would have done far more to disrupt European policy, security policy, policy toward Russia than any kind of military action. Right? So why, I mean, in some sense, it's superseding the military side of NATO. I won't even get into another big country across the ocean. In light of these developments, in this age of cyber, in quotes, democracies need to think beyond the hitherto geographical bounds of security. We need to rethink our security. In addition to those already in existence, we need a new form of defense organization, a non-geographical but strictly criteria-based organization to defend democracies. Countries that generally are democracies as defined by free and fair elections, the rule of law, the guarantee of fundamental rights and freedoms. This idea is not new, yet proposals predating the digital era were guided more by a philosophical, fundamental approach rather than hard security concerns. I can raise two, which I was sort of participating in 20 years ago. In different contexts, both Madeleine Albright and John McCain at the turn of the century proposed the creation of a community or league of democracies. Neither proposal went far at the time. The threats to democracies 20 years ago, however, were not of the type described here today by yours truly. Neither proposal was actually based on security concerns. But today, every liberal democracy is vulnerable. Another potential seed whence to grow genuine security cooperation, actually, I would say, is the CCDCOE here in Tallinn, which has already extended beyond NATO's borders. Yes, it is affiliated with NATO, but it also includes three of the neutral EU members, Finland, Sweden, Austria, who are not, and some of them quite explicitly not in NATO. And CCDCOE is moving beyond the transatlantic space. Membership for Japan and Australia is in the pipeline, and they will soon join the NATO Center. And following basically the structure that membership requires strict adherence to rule of law, free and fair, and of course contested elections. But I would go further. The liberal democratic order needs to collaborate in this realm. The threats we have become aware of will not go away. Indeed, they have been growing and growing. Moreover, we are witnessing in this era a global backlash against integration, openness. Illiberal populists are on the rise, promising to dismantle those same structures that have guaranteed peace and security since World War II. That is the European Union and NATO, at least in our area. Those of us who do not want to give up on the world we have been building for 70 years also need to concede this and recognize the new attack vectors that we face. Alternatively, we can strive to integrate further, to better stand against these new threats. Integration between countries today means opening up our countries, our data flows, for example. We need to trust each other's businesses and technologies. We need to share our information and our knowledge. Ultimately, we can imagine the exchange and interoperability of e-government services, or develop altogether new, uniquely cyber-era defense capabilities. For example, Jared Cohen, president of Jigsaw, formerly known as the formerly Google Ideas, not formerly the artist known as Prince, but anyway, he has suggested, I thought a brilliant idea, that those with greater capacity in machine learning, for example, can offer AI-based cyber defense to those with lesser capabilities, while those under attack would offer to the people with the machine learning capabilities the data that they glean from the attack to further improve the artificial intelligence. I think that's the kind of thing that a NATO-style organization should be capable of. And other opportunities, I think, abound if we start thinking more creatively. Could such an organization do the job to face this new threat? Why not consider cyber defense and a security pact for the genuine democracies of the world? After all, Australia, Japan, Uruguay, and Chile, all rated as free democracies by Freedom House, are just as vulnerable as NATO allies such as the United States, Germany, or my own country. Russia and China have not engaged in this kind of openness. Their vision of the world is one where there is a national cyberspace with censorship, central control. It is a model, but not one that any of our societies, individually or collectively, would want. And so I think it bears thinking. Of course, not saying that you can only trade between democracies is silly, but we can go furthest with countries that we trust on a deep level. Those systems that can be open to each other, and that is with democracies. Finally, let's keep some optimism. People in the traditional democracies admittedly are down on democracy today, but there are a lot of countries that still are striving for it. I think Francis Fukuyama's vision is still in place. Argentina, Brazil, India, Indonesia, Mexico all want to strive towards democracies. Some of them are, in fact, under attack. I mean, in fact, General McMaster said in December, January, that, in fact, there's a heavy Russian attack on Mexico these days. This is the US elections were 2 years ago. The community of democracies isn't just for defense, it's also a signal to the world that there is a community of values that isn't just Western, in quotes, that is global, and that it can defend itself and the values of liberal democracy. So the prospects for safeguarding democracies in the digital era, my time's up, running us through such a pact are probably better now than even a year ago. Nonetheless, until this is taken up by the governments of major countries, both within NATO, outside the alliance, liberal democracies will be ever more vulnerable to the new threats of the 21st century. And I don't want to be a Cassandra here, so I hope you all do something. Thank you very much.